Welcome to the third of 8 lectures in the Princeton Adult Schools and Shepherd series on globalization. Next week's lecture, November the 7th, will be given here, and please note that it will be held on election night. That speaker is Robert Wuthnow, the director of the Center for the Study of Religion, and his topic is globalization and American Christianity. My name is Dr. Mark Brannon, and I am a member of the board of the Princeton Adult School, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Douglas Massey. Douglas S. Massey is the Henry G. Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs. He is also the faculty chair of the PhD program here and the acting director of the program in Latin American Studies. He received in 1974 his BA in Sociology, Psychology, and Spanish from Western Washington University, and then in 1977 the first of two degrees from Princeton University. That was the MA in Sociology, followed the next year by his PhD in Sociology. Professor Massey has served on the faculties of the University of Chicago and the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on international migration, race and housing, discrimination, education, urban poverty, and Latin America, especially Mexico. He's the author, most recently, of Return of the L Word, a liberal vision for the new century, published here by Princeton University Press last year, as well as Strangers in a Strange Land, Humans in an Urbanizing World, published by Norton also last year. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. He is currently the president of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences and the past president of the American Sociological Association and the Population Association of America. Tonight's topic is Backfire at the Border, the Negative Effects of U.S. Immigration Policy, 1986 to 2006. Please welcome Douglas Massey.
Well, the goblins have been in my computer tonight, so can you all hear me? Okay. I'll put this up a little more. There we go. So we'll see if the goblins stay out of my computer for the rest of the time, and if not, I'll just go after it extemporaneously. If you're like most Americans, most of what you learn about immigration in general and Mexican immigration in particular is wrong and pretty mixed up. If you listen to the TV and read the popular news magazines, and certainly if you listen to talk radio, you'd be under the impression that we're being invaded by immigrants from Latin America, especially Mexico. That Mexico is a desperately poor, disorganized country. People are fleeing abject poverty, desperate to get into the United States, and that if we don't erect a high wall, we are bound to be flooded by this tidal wave of immigrants from south of the border. Virtually all those things are incorrect. Mexico is not a desperately poor country. Mexico has a per capita income of around $10,000, compared to about $45,000 in the United States. While obviously they're not as wealthy as the United States, by the standards of the developing world, they're a pretty well-off country. And their poverty rates actually compare favorably to those in places like Russia and many other countries in Eastern Europe, which most people would consider to be more developed than Mexico. Mexico is not out of control demographically. Its total fertility rate is currently 2.2 children per woman, compared to 2.1 in the United States. It's a country of 105 million people with a $1 trillion economy. It's the third largest economy in this hemisphere after the United States, Brazil, and then Mexico. It has entered into a free trade agreement with the United States to bring about the integration of markets in the North American continent. And by treaty, we have arranged with Mexico and Canada to lower the barriers to cross-border movements of all sorts, of goods, of capital, services, of information. But magically, within this integrated North American economy that we have created substantially in the past decade, we want to pretend that there won't be any labor moving and that there won't be certain kinds of people crossing the Mexico-US border. And to finesse this fundamental contradiction and somehow symbolically at least communicate to Americans that somehow we're going to integrate North America and yet remain separate, we've been throwing vast amounts of personnel and resources, material, money at the Mexico-US border to militarize that border, to make it the most militarized border anywhere between two peaceful countries that are in fact one another's largest trading partners. And all this has not bought us any security. All this has not solved the immigration problem. In fact, what I will argue and endeavor to show you today is that on count after count, it has made everything worse. In point of fact, we are not being invaded by a horde of migrants from Mexico to the United States. The data show that the rate of undocumented migration to the United States has not changed in 25 years. And in fact, has gone down slightly in recent years. Yet it is true that undocumented populations in the United States have been growing at an unprecedented rate. How can both of these things be true? That's what I'm going to show you. The work that I'm going to present to you, I draw from government statistics, but of course government statistics will only take you so far. Government statistics can tell us how many people were apprehended, can tell us the trade balance between Mexico and the United States, can give you a lot of official indicators, but they don't tell you a lot about the process of undocumented migration. And that's where the Mexican Migration Project comes in. For the past 25 years, I've been collaborating with my friend in the University of Guadalajara, Jorge Durand, to run the Mexican Migration Project. Every year, we go into Mexico, do representative samples of different communities around Mexico, find out, we do representative samples of the communities, we apply questionnaires to everyone in the communities, and we ask questions about migratory experience. We find out who's been to the United States and when. And for everybody in every household who's ever been to the United States, we collect basic information on their first and their most recent trips and get information on the total number of trips. Every household head contributes a complete life history to our database. A complete life history that includes, if they are migrants, a complete history of migration and border crossing for every trip they've ever made to the United States from the age of 15 up to the survey date. These data we have assembled over the past 25 years into a large database which currently has 107 different community samples. It has, I forget the exact number, something like 19,000 migrants in the database and about 200,000 person years worth of observation on household heads. So it is a large, not entirely representative, but certainly better than anything else out there, source of information on migration to the United States. The project has been funded over the years by a grant from the National Institutes of Health, where Congress, in its infinite wisdom, put demographic research, and with supplementary funding over the years from the Mellon Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation, and a few others. All of the data, all the results that I report to you today are based on data that are publicly available. Anybody can download them from our web base any time of the day or night, 24/7. All the data are completely public and open to scrutiny. Anyone who doubts what I can say can download the data and calculate it for themselves to find out. So the Mexican Migration Project has been at it for quite a few years. All the dots are places where we've done community samples. And the states that are colored green are the ones where we have a set of community surveys that we've done. Notice that the dots are mostly, densest right in the west central part of Mexico. And the reason for that is the heartland for migration to the United States. As far back as we can trace the data, to early in the 20th century, up to the present, at least half of all migrants have come from the states in that western corner, not near the border. Most migrants do not come from the border region. They come from those west central states. The states, if you know Mexico, of Michoacán, Jalisco, Guanajuato, San Luis Potosí, and Zacatecas. Those 5 states encompass at least 50% of all migrants to the United States going way back to the early part of the 20th century. Over the years, we've broadened out, and we've endeavored to do survey work in Oaxaca and the southern states, which are newer sending regions, and more recently, we've done border states. Ironically, when we do studies on the border, we find the probability of migration to the United States is actually very low, lower than in the interior. Why? Why do you need to migrate if you're on the border? You can go, if you have a steady job, you can get a permit to go across and shop, do whatever you want. Those are the highest wage areas in Mexico and the most rapidly growing part of Mexico. And so the rates of migration from the border region are among the lowest in Mexico. Most of the migrants come from the interior. And so historically, that's where our survey research has been concentrated. The sample that I'm going to report to you, the data analysis that I'm going to report to you today comes from an earlier version of the data set with 93 communities surveyed through 2002. As I said, now we have 107 up, but this particular analysis was based on an earlier version of the database. So we've got data on 20,000 migrants, 12,000 undocumented migrants, and 6,209 complete life histories. The data, the analysis that I'm going to describe to you was substantially reported in a book called Beyond Smoke and Mirrors, which was published in 2002. And if you're really interested in the database and some of the more details of what I'm going to talk about today, you can consult that work. As I've said, the United States basically is trying to finesse a fundamental contradiction in North America. In 1986, 2 things happened. One, Mexico was in the middle of an economic crisis. And the U.S. Treasury, the IMF, and the Reagan administration were putting the screws to Mexico to open up its economy, to shift from a very state-led development strategy known as import substitution industrialization to a more market-oriented strategy that's come to be known as neoliberalism. Mexico was in no position to bargain and was being managed by a new cadre of technocratic elites who agreed that the solution to Mexico's problems was to privatize markets, to open up to investment, to dismantle trade barriers, to downsize the government, and so on. And so in 1986, Mexico did an about-face and did something that it had refused to do since the end of the Second World War, and that's join the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1986, basically signaling that Mexico was opening itself up to international investment, opening itself up to trade, and hoping to advance and develop through a model of export industrialization, following the pathway of places like Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and so on. 1986 was also the year on the U.S. side that the U.S. Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act. The Immigration Reform and Control Act was billed then as a legislative vehicle to solve the problem of undocumented migration. It authorized an amnesty for people who had been in the country in undocumented status for at least 5 years, which was then the paltry figure of about 4 or 5 million people. It, for the first time in American history, criminalized undocumented hiring. That is, before 1986, if a migrant showed up at a workplace and said, "Give me a job," and the employer gave him a job, and the authorities came and raided his workplace, then the migrant could be carted off and deported, but nothing would happen to the employer. It was perfectly legal to hire anybody who showed up. After 1986, that was no longer true. And I will describe some of the consequences of that to you later. Finally, the last provision was to substantially increase the resources for border enforcement, dramatically increasing the amount of money allocated to the Border Patrol for materiel and personnel, beginning what would be a 20-year escalation of enforcement actions along the border. So in 1986, the U.S. is basically doing two things. On the one hand, is pushing Mexico towards opening up and entering a closer economic relationship with the United States. It had been walled off. But on the other hand, it was saying, well, you may open up in a lot of venues, but we don't want any labor. And we're going to pass this law to take unilateral actions on our border. Mexico joined GATT in 86. The Mexican president who followed in 1988, named Salinas de Gortari, wanted to institutionalize the market reforms and make them permanent. So he approached the United States and Canada and asked to join NAFTA. His approach was received enthusiastically by the Bush I administration. Negotiations were begun and concluded at the end of the Bush administration, ratified at the beginning of the Clinton administration, and came into effect on January 1st, 1994. NAFTA took effect. So what you have here on the screen are some indicators of economic integration in North America. It's the degree of total trade, the cross-border traffic and business visitors, intercompany transferees, and exchange visitors between Mexico and the United States. So you can see not a whole lot was happening until 1986, when Mexico joined the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades. Then there's an acceleration in cross-border movements of all sort. The red line is total trade. Then after 1994, there's an acceleration. And this acceleration really zooms up at an exponential pace until we hit the recession of 2000-2001. Basically, since 1986, when Mexico adopted this new development model in partnership with the United States, total trade has increased by a factor of more than 8. And the number of intercompany transferees going across the border has increased by a factor of about 5.5. The number of business visitors has gone up by a factor of about 4. And the number of exchange visitors has gone up by a factor of 3. So in keeping with the provisions of our broader program of economic integration, there's a lot of movement back and forth across the border now. However, at the same time that we have promoted certain kinds of movement and opened up the border to certain kinds of flows, we've insisted on the unilateral right to close that border, or at least to attempt to close that border with respect to movement of wage labor, to people who work. And what we have here are indicators of border enforcement. Again, everything is shown relative to its value in 1986. So it's changed until 1986. 1986 we begin, that's when the Immigration Reform and Control Act passes, we begin a process of border buildup. The Border Patrol budget is in red. The purple line is line watch hours, which are the number of person hours spent patrolling the Mexico-U.S. border, and the green line is the number of Border Patrol officers. So as you can see, there's been a huge increase in border enforcement activities. From 1986 to 1984, the trend was rather was substantial, but then after 1993, 1994, there was really an exponential increase in border enforcement. In 1993, the U.S. launched Operation Blockade in El Paso, the El Paso sector of the Mexico-U.S. border, basically concentrating an immense wall of resources through the urbanized part of El Paso, Texas, stationing every 150 yards a Chevy Blazer with 2 Border Patrol officers staring at the border, installing footfall detectors, infrared devices, helicopters, putting up wall along with the more traversed sectors of the border, and installing Klieg lights through the entire urbanized part of that border. And guess what? Traffic through that sector dropped precipitously. And then it was such a success in El Paso that next year the Border Patrol launched it in San Diego, and they launched Operation Gatekeeper, where they did the same thing, only bigger and better. Where through the built-up part of the San Diego sector, basically from the Pacific Ocean up into the Sierra Mountains, they not only installed footfall detectors, infrared devices, sent up helicopters, put on drones, put up video monitors, put up Klieg lights so that if you're on the Tijuana side of the line in the middle of the night, it's like high noon because it's so lit up. Not only did they do all that, but they were wondering what could they do with all that extra tarmac that was left over from the Gulf War when somebody in Washington said, let's turn it into an iron wall and put it up between Tijuana and San Diego. So they took up the tarmac from the Gulf, shipped it back, and they erected a steel wall that runs from the Pacific Ocean up to the Sierra Madre Mountains. And later, they decided that wasn't enough, and they had more tarmac to use, and so they built 3 walls, 1, 2, 3, right after one another. And again, in this sector was a resounding success. Tijuana had been the biggest and the busiest border crossing point between Mexico and the United States, and traffic after this was reduced to a small trickle. Well, what happened? Was it successful in deterring migrants from coming to the United States? Well, if you've been reading the paper, you know what happened. Suddenly, Arizona is hopping. Arizona, which had been a backwater on the border, having no migrants, hadn't really been even a destination for a significant number of migrants since the 1920s, suddenly became alive as the flows that had been crossing it hitherto, the 2 busiest sectors, El Paso and Tijuana, El Paso and San Diego, were suddenly redirected. If you build a wall here, you divert the flows. And they diverted the flows out into more remote country in the mountains, in the desert, and in the lower portions, the wilder parts of the Rio Grande Valley, pushing people away from traditional crossing points. And you see this in the Mexican Migration Project data. The top shows, the red line, shows the number of people crossing at a new crossing point, where a new crossing point is defined any other place except for El Paso and San Diego. So you can see that through the late 1980s, even after 86, there was still a growing specialization in crossing at these 2 crossing points. So that by 1988, 1989, 70% of all border crossings went through these 2 sectors. Well, in 93, they started hardening the border. Well, they actually started hardening the border in those 2 sectors, and then they really started hardening it after 93, and then there was a complete reversal in trend. And by 2002, by the present, something like 2/3 are crossing somewhere else. There's a major diversion of the flows away from these built-up sectors along the border. The second thing that happened is once you've diverted the flows away from California, they kept on going. And they proceeded to new destinations. The blue line at the bottom shows not where you crossed, but where you ended up. And here, it's whether you go to a new destination. And a new destination is defined as any state other than California, Texas, and anybody know the third? Illinois. Chicago, Illinois is the 2nd largest concentration of Mexicans in the United States after Los Angeles. And if you've been to Chicago, this won't come as any surprise to you. So the 3 traditional destination states for Mexican immigration since the 1960s, Chicago goes back to the 1920s, are Illinois, Texas, and California. And California was the giant of them all. About 2/3 of all Mexican immigrants before the border buildup went to California. As you can see from the blue line, once we've deflected the flows, the destinations also shifted. And starting in around 1993, 1994, there was a progressive shift of migrants from these traditional destination states into brand new destination states. And by 2002, about 55% of migrants are going somewhere else. You can see this in census data. If you look at census data and looked at Mexican-born people who arrived between 85 and 90, 2/3 ended up in California. If you look at those who arrived between 2000 and 2005, 1/3 ended up in California. So basically, you dramatically reduced the flows into California. Where did they go? Well, Princeton, New Jersey. They went everywhere. The border buildup and the selective nature of that border buildup was instrumental in transforming what had been a regional phenomenon affecting 3 states into a national phenomenon affecting 50 states. There are now large and growing populations of Mexicans in every state in the Union, including Alaska and Hawaii. In Alaska, undocumented migrants from Mexico are outnumbered by undocumented migrants from Russia, however. But they are there. Another thing that happened was we did succeed in driving up the price of crossing the border. This is, according to the Mexican Migration Project, in constant dollars, the average cost of hiring a coyote or one of those people to smuggle you across the border. And you can see for years it was flat, around $400, the average cost of hiring somebody to get you across the border. Then, after Operation Blockade was launched, there's a rapid escalation until now. It's around $1,200. So we've quadrupled, or we tripled the cost, out-of-pocket costs that migrants pay to get across the border. And we've also increased the risks of border crossing. What we have here is the death rate among border crossers. The numerator comes from a project, the death rate, the number of deaths, that is, comes from a project at the University of Houston called the Border Death Project, which combs through death statistics, death registrations on both sides of the border to compile a list of people who have died under suspicious circumstances. We can compute the estimated number of attempted crossings using the MMP data and form a rate in this fashion. So you see that in the early 1990s, the rate was about 2 per 10,000 attempts resulted in a death. Afterwards, it skyrocketed up to around 6 per 10,000 attempts. And this translates into about 400 extra deaths per year along the border. Because what you're doing is pushing people out away from where before you'd cross and you'd be in Chula Vista, California, where the worst thing that's going to happen to you is going to be maybe mugged by a cholo or something. Now you're crossing into desert, crossing into remote mountain areas, you're crossing in wilder parts of the Rio Grande, you're subject to drowning, you're subject to dehydration, you're subject to exposure. And so the death rate from these causes has skyrocketed. One other unanticipated consequence is if we push people away from the built-up parts of the border into more remote territory, you not only increase their risks of getting injured or killed, you also decrease their risk of getting caught because there are fewer Border Patrol officers out there. So what we have plotted here is the probability of apprehension on any given attempt at coming into the United States. Before 1986, and this line can be extended back in time, the odds of getting caught were about 1 in 3, about 33%. And that goes back into the 1970s, and it's consistent with other information that's independent of ours. So everybody's consistent in showing that up until 1986, the odds were about 1 in 3. Then after 86, they fell because the Border Patrol was throwing money at the problem without any real relationship to the underlying flows, and they were grandstanding on the war on drugs, so a lot of their money was going into drug interdiction rather than migration. Then they launched Operation Blockade and Operation Gatekeeper, and the unsuspecting migrants walked into this wall of enforcement resources. And so naturally, you get this big increase in the rate of apprehension. But then the migrants wise up, as we've seen, and they cross somewhere else. And then from then on, the probability of apprehension actually plummets. And now is at a 40-year low. So the net effect of building up the border has been to reduce the probability of apprehension to a 40-year low and spread the immigration from a regional phenomenon to a national phenomenon. In the border buildup, let me give you a few numbers. In 1986, the Border Patrol's budget was about $250 million, and it had about 2,000 officers. Today, the Border Patrol's budget is about $1.6 billion, and it has 12,000 officers. The Border Patrol is now the largest arms-bearing branch of the government except the military itself. During the 1990s, the two of the largest and most rapidly growing federal job categories were immigration inspector and border patrol officer. Of course, 85% of the border patrol is of Hispanic origin. Now what happens? What happens if suddenly there's a major policy shift and people have been migrating across this border for decades? But suddenly there's a major policy shift and the costs, your out-of-pocket costs go up, your risks go up, the risk of death goes up, the risk of injury goes up, and the general unpleasantness of the whole thing goes up. Well, migrants, being reasonable people, do the rational thing, and they minimize border crossing. They do not minimize border crossing by ceasing to cross. They minimize border crossing by staying longer once they're here, by hunkering down rather than facing the gauntlet at the border again. They had been circulating back and forth. Once the border is militarized, the circulation begins to disappear. The top red line shows the probability of returning to Mexico within 12 months of entry. You can see that starting with the Immigration Reform and Control Act and the border buildup, there's been a steady decline in the rate of return migration. And basically, according to some estimates, it's been cut in about half. The bottom lines, the green one shows the probability of taking a first undocumented trip for a Mexican male, and the purple one is probability of a first undocumented trip for the Mexican female. Again, calculated from the Mexican Migration Project data, and anybody can go and calculate it for themselves to see if I'm right. As you can see, the probability of migration to the United States is pretty much flat. Hardly changes at all. Going back to 1980, and doesn't change much if you go back even farther than that. The rate of in-migration to the United States from Mexico has not changed. Nothing has changed along the border. The only thing that's changed is our border policy. And what that has done is not to affect the inflow, but dramatically cut the outflow. In demography, we got this thing called a balance equation. Net migration equals immigrants minus immigrants. Now, if this stays the same and this goes down, what happens? Net migration increases. So, while it is true that there has been no increase in the pace of undocumented migration from Mexico, and in fact, if you look at later trips, I put up here the probability of taking a first trip, say, what's the probability of taking a second or a third trip, that's actually come down a bit. But those small changes have been swamped by the rapid decline in the rate of return migration. And so, what we've had is an unprecedented acceleration in the rate of undocumented population growth in the United States. And you can see this. This is the number of Mexicans in the United States as enumerated by the U.S. Census Bureau. And you can see that something happened in the mid-1990s. Something happened. And this is census data. And if you look at the rate of change from 1998 to roughly 2002 and compare that to the rate of change that went before, it's about a doubling of the rate of change, which is consistent with a halving of the rate of outmigration. So, the net effect of our spending $1.6 billion a year in border enforcement, militarizing the border with a peaceful and friendly trading nation, has not been to solve the immigration problem, but has done everything that one can think of to make it worse. It has increased the number of people living north of the border in undocumented status. It has taken what was a regional phenomenon and made it a national phenomenon. It has also transformed what had been a population of male workers that circulated back and forth into a settled population of families. And families cost more than labor-age males traveling alone. So we've driven up the costs to ourselves. One other effect And this goes back to one of the pieces of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which criminalized undocumented hiring. The intent was to eliminate the magnet of U.S. jobs. As you can see, it didn't eliminate the magnet of U.S. jobs. What it did do was restructure the hiring process in the United States. Before 1986, since there was no penalty to hiring an undocumented migrant, if a foreign-born person showed up at your work site, looked like he could work or she could work, hire him. And if the authorities come, worst case scenario is you lose your workers for a day. But somehow they had a way of drifting back. Nothing would happen to you. After 1986, you were liable to fines, civil penalties, and even imprisonment for repeat offenses. Moreover, the government started requiring you to keep a whole bunch of paperwork. Every time you hired somebody, you had to fill out what's called an I-9 form that attested that you've seen documents that confirm identity and the right to work in the United States. And so basically what employers started having to do was keep I-9 forms on file, photocopy documents, and then if they're ever raided by immigration authorities, they say, well, I didn't know they were illegal. Here's my I-9 form, and they'd be off the hook. But that's a big burden in industries with a lot of turnover. And so what employers did was rather than hire directly, they massively shifted to labor subcontracting. Instead of hiring the undocumented migrant, you'd say, well, you better go see my subcontractor because he does all the hiring, and I have a contract with him. And the subcontractor would be a citizen or a resident alien or someone with the legal right to do business in the United States. And they would sign a contract saying that they would provide X number of workers at X dollars an hour for X period of time to work under certain conditions. And then if the migratory authorities came and raided your Walmart, you'd say, we're shocked to discover so many illegal migrants here. You better talk to our subcontractor. And that's exactly the defense they used when they pleaded no contest and paid a $60 million fine because they were systematically using subcontractors to hire undocumented workers throughout their stores. Just remember that Walmart smile. So, what happens if you work through a subcontractor? Subcontractors don't work for free. Subcontractors take a portion of the wage bill that used to go directly to the workers and they pocket it. The net effect of subcontractors then has been to reduce the wages and undermine the working conditions. Not simply of undocumented migrants who always had it bad, but of citizens and resident aliens who work in the same industries. Because it doesn't matter now what your citizenship status is. You could come over on the Mayflower. You still got to work through a subcontractor now. That's how it's done. And what it did was eliminate the ladder of upward mobility for legal migrants. So you can see the blue line at the top, which doesn't show up real good here, I guess. That is the average wage earned by legal immigrants to the United States. The red line is the average wage earned by undocumented migrants to the United States. So you see that there used to be a big gap between the two. IRCA passes, and there's this monumental reorganization of the labor market, and suddenly the returns to legal status start to disappear. Before 1986, once you controlled for things like experience, English language ability, job tenure, and so on, there was no significant difference in the wages earned by a legal versus an illegal migrant. After 1986, there were gaps that opened up, and the returns to things like experience, the returns to things like education, the returns to English language ability began to evaporate. So what the criminalization of undocumented employment of hiring did was not to stop migrants from coming to the United States, but to undermine wages and working conditions and eliminate ladders of mobility in the low-wage sector of the American economy, not just for undocumented, but more importantly for illegals and citizens. Anyone who works in industries like gardening, agriculture, janitorial services, custodial services, any of these service industries now all work through subcontractors. So what we have done is through these policies is create a workforce that is more and more composed of people who are in exploitable categories. The lines here show the proportion of foreign-born people living in the United States who are in different categories. The red line is illegal. The blue line is legal in various legal statuses. The purple line is citizen. The only one with unrestrained labor market rights in the United States is citizen. And that proportion has gone down from about 50% of the foreign-born population to about, in the year 1999, 2000, to about 40%. The proportion of illegals since the legalization under IRCA in the mid-80s, late 80s, has gone up and is now around 25%. And during the 1990s, there was a big expansion in the number of people in temporary work with H visas, huge increase in number of H visas. So what American immigration policy done has basically increased the number of people in exploitable categories. H visas are not free to move. So if your boss treats you lousy, doesn't fulfill promises, you can't say, I quit, I'm going to go find another job. You're stuck. No bargaining power. And of course, if you're undocumented, no bargaining power whatsoever. In fact, if you open your mouth, the employer could just happen to call his friends at the Immigration Service and let them know your address. So what have we got for our billions of dollars? And the $1.6 billion that we spend on the Border Patrol is just a fraction. It's the tip of the iceberg. Because there's a larger budget for the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which maintains a whole gulag of prisons and detention facilities. And that budget's like $4 billion a year. So we're spending around $6 billion a year. Since the Immigration and Naturalization Service was broken up and shifted out of the Department of Justice and into the Department of Homeland Security, it's become very difficult to get exact figures on these things. So we don't exactly know anymore how much the government is spending on border enforcement because now it's a state secret. What have we got? We're spending $6 billion a year, ostensibly to increase the security of the United States, ostensibly to prevent workers from coming into the United States. In fact, the consequences of our spending and our pattern of border enforcement has been to increase the rate of undocumented population growth in the United States, to create a crisis where there was none before, to take what had been a regional phenomenon affecting 3 states, make it a national phenomenon affecting 50 states, to take what had been a circular flow of male workers and turn it into a settled population of costly families, and drive down the wages and working conditions for citizens and resident aliens in the low-wage sector of the U.S. economy to exacerbate already skyrocketing levels of income inequality. It doesn't sound like a good policy to me. And at the end of Beyond Smoke and Mirrors, Jorge and I and our colleague Nolan Malone, devote a chapter to rethinking immigration policy and talking about what one might do. Just to give you a hint of the approach we take, basically we say it requires a different shift in philosophy. And by the way, that's the tarmac right there. You can see it. That's a picture of tarmac that's been dug up from the Gulf and brought over and made into a fence. A shift in philosophy. So we're integrating with Mexico. We're part of a free trade agreement. Mexico's not our enemy. Mexico's not a terror threat. There are no Islamic populations in Mexico. There's no terrorist cells in Mexico. No terrorist has ever crossed the United States from Mexico into the United States. There are Islamic populations in Canada. There are terrorist cells in Canada. Terrorists have crossed from Canada and the United States with the intent to attack. And yet, there's no hysteria about the Canadian border. So it's not an issue of national security. What we argue is we should treat immigration as a natural byproduct of broader processes of integration that are occurring in the economies of North America. And rather than trying to suppress it, which has proved to be spectacularly unsuccessful, we should try to bring it above board and manage and regulate it in ways that benefit all parties. Immigration, of course, has costs. The people that come in the abstract category labor, labor ends up being full of human beings. And they get sick, they get hurt, they fall in love, they get married, all kinds of things happen to people rather than labor. And so there are inevitably going to be costs. But right now, there's no way to reimburse states and localities who pay most of the costs because there's no adjustment in the federal revenue sharing formula to take account of the fact that some states have to pay a lot of money for immigrants. The tax revenues accrue to the federal government, but they don't make their way back down to the states and localities. Well, you can solve this problem if you bring it above board. You bring them above board, you give people temporary work visas with special numbers that allow you to identify the tax revenues from them, and you make those available to the places where they go. Moreover, if you're going to set up a temporary visa program, why not charge them? They're paying $1,200. Cut the price in half, charge them $600. They'll be thrilled. $300,000 workers, $600. What's that? 1.8 million. With the revenues you can get, you can create an insurance pool. So when an undocumented worker breaks his finger on the job and shows up in an emergency room, it's not an unreimbursed medical expense. They charge it somewhere. So what we've advocated is setting up a temporary worker program because most Mexican migrants, when they begin to come to the United States, their intention is not to settle. It's to solve an economic problem at home, and they're just using the U.S. labor market as a tool to earn some money to overcome some market failure in Mexico. The biggest one is a lack of a mortgage market. How do you finance the construction of a house or an acquisition of a house if there's no mortgage market? Well, in the absence of a good mortgage market, you migrate to the United States, you work 3 or 4 seasons, channel the money back, build your house, voila. But if you erect a barrier, then people are up here and they keep thinking, well, I'll go back, but it's too costly to go back. And the longer they stay, the more roots they put down, the less likely they are ever to go back. If you just give them the temporary work visa in the first place, you would minimize the number of people who are staying here. And you would allow them to go back, and if you're worried about them going back, deduct taxes from their paychecks and then make it partially repayable upon return to Mexico. Also, our immigration quota for Mexico is ridiculously small. It's the same as any other country in the world. You know what every country in the world gets? 20,000 visas. So Mexico, our largest trading partner, 105 million people. It's 1 million Americans living in Mexico now. There are 10 million Mexicans living in the United States now. As you can see, escalating flows of all sorts back and forth across the border. It has the same immigration quota as Botswana or Nepal, 20,000. No difference. It's a formula that's designed to create illegal migration. So we advocate increasing the size of the quota to something more reasonable for a country that's so closely tied to the United States. 100,000 visas per year, maybe. plus 300,000 guest worker visas. You'd probably get rid of most illegal migration right there. And it's not only illegal migrants who are less likely to go home. When you freeze the border, it's legal migrants who are less likely to go home because a lot of them are connected to illegal migrants and they don't want to leave them. So you'd actually end up with fewer people living in the United States, lower social costs in the United States, more rapid growth and development in Mexico to overcome the market failures that drive people here in the first place. So the bottom line is what we argue is that the United States should be treating Mexico, the US and Canada should be treating Mexico in much the same way that Northern Europe treated Spain and Portugal when they brought them into the European Union. They were vastly poorer countries. They'd come off of 30, 40 years of fascist dictatorship. Their economies were a mess. There were centralized command structures, not competitive. Northern Europeans were scared because there had been an outflow of Spanish until then. And they thought once they dropped restrictions on labor mobility, we're going to be flooded with Spanish workers. But they bit the bullet and they said, well, we're going to bring them in as equal partners and we're going to give them free labor mobility, so we'll phase in over a period and do that. And in the interim, they made available a lot of money out of union funds as subsidies to Mexico to bring its to Spain and Portugal to bring their infrastructure up to minimal standards for the European Union. Not the same as Germany, but up to some minimal standards. So they improved mortgage markets, so Spanish didn't have to emigrate to finance home construction or acquisition. They improved social services. They improved the highway system. They improved transportation and communication with some additional help. And what happened when Spain and Portugal joined the European Union and had, finally in 1986, full rights to move anywhere they wanted? There was a massive return flow of Spanish back to Spain. Not only that, there was a massive flow of Germans down to the coast of Brava. So now there are Balearic Islands and towns along the coast that have German mayors. And you see a harbinger of this in Mexico. You see Ensenada, California is full of American condo owners. So if we'd simply treat Mexico in the same way that Spain and Portugal were treated by the European Union, if we'd done that back in 1994 when NAFTA was first put into effect, I believe that now we would have no immigration problem, much less a crisis. I've argued this publicly, written about it in books, articles. In the past 18 months, I've testified 3 times before Congress, 3 times before the Senate Judiciary Committee, trying to get people to understand this way of thinking about the issue. But I must say, it's a tough sell. People have their minds made up. Don't talk to me with your lying numbers. I know what the truth is. And judging by my hate mail, when I publish pieces in the New York Times or the Washington Post, most people say you're one of those liberals that is stoned out on cocaine or else you wouldn't be able to write something like this. But everything that I've said, I believe is completely theoretically understandable in terms of what we know about how people migrate, why they migrate, what the forces producing migration are, and they're certainly consistent with the empirical data and make a far more compelling, more cogent story and lead to a far better way of managing immigration than what we've experienced over the past 20 years, which I think have been an unmitigated disaster for all concerned. Maximizing the problems for the United States, minimizing the benefits to Mexico, and really unfolding human rights tragedy for the migrants themselves. So I hope perhaps I may have convinced you to look at immigration in a different way, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. And thank the Virgin for protecting me from the gremlins.
One of the issues in immigration policy has been whether people here illegally should have a path to U.S. citizenship. Do you have any feeling about that?
well, there's a lot of confusion about these different legal statuses. So everybody who becomes a permanent resident alien has a path to citizenship in 5 years. And for the undocumented population, what is being proposed is a variety of programs that will put some of them on a path to a green card, not necessarily to citizenship. That's another decision down the road. I advocate approaching it from a two-pronged attack. You got two basic populations in the undocumented now. About 11 million people are undocumented. Ballpark, roughly 3 million of those are people who entered the country as minors. They're people who entered under the age of 18, often as infants. And really, they're guilty of no crime other than obeying their parents. Most of these people have grown up in the United States, speak English, gone to high school, and unless their status is regularized, their lives are ruined. I mean, basically, they have no upward mobility. They could be deported at a moment's notice back to a country they don't know. They may not even speak the language. And they can't get on with their lives here. So for people who can document that they entered the country as minors, and school records make that easy to do, I advocate an unconditional amnesty with the usual provisos that they're not felons and otherwise problematic, otherwise meet the criteria for entering the United States. These people are guilty of nothing but obeying their parents. Okay? Their parents. Some of them made the decision to cross the border illegally, and maybe we don't want to reward people that took this infraction, but at least now under current law, this infraction is a civil penalty and not a criminal penalty. And many of these people actually tried to work within the system, but the system failed them, and they ended up in illegal status despite their best effort. It's the case that the immigration system is woefully underfunded and very badly organized. And if they lose your paperwork and you fall out of status, you can't say, well, you did this to me. You're still out of status and you're deportable. So unless you go home right then, abandon your family here, your kids who may be American-born citizens, unless you do that immediately, you're out of status and deportable. And under current law, once you're out of status and deportable and caught, you're not even eligible to apply for a green card for 10 years. So what I advocate for these other people who come in a variety of different packages and statuses, and they got into this position through a variety of different ways, some of which were more volitional than others, is first of all, offer them one of these temporary worker permits. Some fraction of them will be happy to work for 3 years and then go home. For others who have acquired ties to the United States, we set up a path of earned legalization so that you get points for having American-born kids, paying taxes, being a homeowner, staying out of trouble, learning English, taking American civics, whatever you want to do. And you earn points so that there's a pathway over time to legal status. I believe that that's the only humane way to proceed right now, where we've got 12 million people, 11 to 12 million people out of status. 3 million of them are kids who really are blameless in all this, and the rest of whom are in a variety of different statuses, but none of which are criminal statuses, which are all civil infractions. And most of these people have no criminal intent. And some of them will go home if you offer them a temporary legalization with a chance to return home after 3 years. Others who have ties into this country should be given a chance to earn their way in.
Does the government of Mexico agree with you? And if so, why don't they have a more liberal policy on this?
I'm not sure. I haven't had any official contact with the Mexican government. I suspect that they're sympathetic to my point of view. And there's a couple reasons that Mexico's not more lenient on their southern border. One is, they suffer from many of the same sins we do. And B, they're under pressure from the United States to be hard ass on that border. And they're receiving technical assistance to do so. And that's one cheap way for Mexico to earn points with the United States government in hopes of easing things up for their own people. So I think if you're going to deal with these issues, you got to deal with them in a broader context. And so if you're going to come up to some arrangement with the Mexico-U.S. border, then you have to think about the Guatemalan border with Mexico as well, and come to some kind of unified procedure that both Mexico and the U.S. buy into and agree upon, much in the same way that the European Union has done with the new entrants like Poland. Yeah.
What happens with selective service, or if they're, are they afraid to register, or if they volunteer without any other background? Are they American citizens after?
No, not automatically. If, in fact, you don't have to be a citizen at all to be in the U.S. Army, in the U.S. military. And if you volunteer as an illegal migrant and you come in the American military, you can still be an illegal migrant but still be a part of the military. However, it does give you certain rights to adjust status and become a permanent resident alien after a period of time. And then after that, after another period of time, I think it's faster for ex-military, 3 years instead of 5 years, you can become a U.S. citizen. So there are some people who have adopted their path to citizenship by volunteering for the military for duty in Iraq. That is a number of people. I don't know the number. It's probably not real big, but there are people who've done that. One of the other things I do is collect Mexican popular art. And maybe you saw in Ehrenberg Hall in May and June, there was an exhibition of votive paintings that we've assembled that are paintings that people leave at shrines all over Mexico, really in the west central part of Mexico that I described to you, thanking the Virgin or some image of the Christ child for a miracle. And we discovered in our explorations that a lot of these paintings deal with migration to the United States and miracles that have happened to people in the course of their migratory experiences. And so we started assembling a collection, and we have 60 of these paintings now in our collection, dating back to around early 1900s up until the present. And everything that happens to people ends up on the walls of these churches, and anything that happens to migrants ends up on the walls of these churches. And so every war ends up on these churches. So you'll have retablos, they're called, thanking the Virgin for getting a husband or a brother back from First World War, Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War, Gulf War. And I haven't been down lately, but I guarantee you there's stuff from the Iraq War right now.
A couple comments and observations. I was down in Baja not terribly long ago, and yeah, the wall is scary and amazing. And there's a lot of folks that have actually that live on the other side of the border and commute to jobs in San Diego, and they go right through and all that. So that's sort of the new model. Two other things. One is my mother was an immigrant and came over, and there was a path for her to get in. And it strikes me as one of the fundamental issues is that the INS is not able to do their basic job of screening folks to see if they should be here, irregardless of the quotas, and operate as a functional organization. In one of my, I'd say former life, one of the things I used to do, we used to have to deal with the INS, and we could not get them to take someone who had committed a felony, take them away. They're convicted, if they were not on the hit list of the immigrant du jour, whether it's Iraqi or Iranian, whoever it is, you would call up, they'd have somebody that's convicted of selling drugs in the United States, and they're like, well, they've been enough crimes, it's like,
Yeah, the INS has long been dysfunctional in some. If you're a customer trying to get something out of the service, it's real dysfunctional. It's really difficult to deal with. How many of you here has had any kind of official dealings with the immigration bureaucracy on any issue? And you probably know what I'm talking about. I know because my daughter is an immigrant. I adopted a little girl from Paraguay, brought her into the country when she was 12 months old. So I've worked through the immigration system from the other side, and I've seen how it is. We're trying to file the papers for her citizenship, and we went down, we were in Chicago then, we drove downtown to downtown Chicago, went to the IN office, wanted to hand them to somebody to make sure they got there, and nobody would accept them. We can't take them. So what we had to do was walk across the street to the federal post office on Jackson and express mail them across the street. Now, to be fair, most of these people working here have horrible jobs, and they're between a rock and a hard place. They have too big a caseload, they don't have enough resources, they don't have enough training. It's not called the INS anymore. It's called the Bureau of Citizenship and Immigrant Services. They don't have the computing power to do it. A lot of their stuff's still paper, and it's just a nightmare. And there's so many places in the system where things can go wrong, and if they go wrong, you're screwed up, not them.
But I guess my point is instead of building this $1.6 billion wall, wouldn't our money be better spent getting people that have already committed crimes in the U.S. and getting rid of them? I mean, getting the people that have sort of come to the fore because of their own bad behavior, worry about those versus spending our efforts on folks that are.
Well, I would agree, and but it's gotten worse since the whole operation moved out of Department of Justice, which at least had a mission justice, right? And now it's the Homeland Security, so mission's completely different. And they've really got this kind of bang bang shoot 'em up enforcement mentality. All the money is going into enforcement activities, and enforcement is defined as boots on the ground type stuff. Not actually cross-checking your records to see who's staying here too long, see who that is, checking against known terrorist lists when people enter. Those sorts of things, no, don't do that. We want more people down on the border with Mexico where all the terrorists really are. They're all crossing down there, right? Now, if you were Al-Qaeda, where would you go? Let's send our operatives to Tijuana, where they can blend in with the locals. Why would we go to a place like Toronto, where there's only like 400,000 Pakistanis? Let's just go to Tijuana, and then we'll set up a cell there, and then we'll cross the most fortified border in the entire world between two peaceful countries. Why don't we do that? Now, the whole thing is insane, absolutely insane. Why are we spending $4 billion to put an iron wall in the front of our house while neither side of the house has a wall at all and the back door is flapping wide open? If you were doing this to protect your house, people think you're out of your mind. Yeah. Pretty tough for Congress, though.
If we sit, well, that's the nature of my question. If we accept the fact that they're not completely ignorant, right? There's got to be something that's driving the behavior, whether it be the influence of special interests or political agenda or bureaucratic inertia or whatever it may be. Why would they behave in such an uninformed, ill-advised manner?
Well, there are some people in Congress that appreciate the realities of the situation and are working to try to do. McCain and Kennedy, they're basically trying to push forward on these. Their staffs and both McCain and Kennedy have read Beyond Smoke and Mirrors, and they've had me come down and talk to them. And they are convinced by the arguments. They're just trying to figure out the politics of how to get it done. Now, the politics is what's all messed up in this country. There's Americans are nervous and afraid right now, with good reason. If you're a middle-class American, social safety net's in pretty tattered form. Health insurance, if you've got it now, you're not quite sure you're going to have it a year from now. Income inequality and wealth inequalities are at levels that we haven't seen since the 1920s. The middle class is getting hammered. And things are changing. And then on top of this, 9/11 happens, and you feel physically threatened as well. And in this kind of context, the cheap thing for a politician to do to get easy votes is to demagogue immigrants. Listening to Lou Dobbs, you'd think that Mexicans flew the planes on September 11th. And people talk about, unless we throw more enforcement at that border with Mexico, our national security is horribly compromised. And I'm saying, if you took like a fraction of 1% of the money you're throwing at the border and used it to build a better internal computer system to check who's coming in and out of the United States, then you would have noticed that 3 of those terrorists that got in on student visas were on terrorist watch lists. They didn't come in through Mexico. Nobody came in through Mexico. There have been people, a couple of them did time in Canada, and the Millennium Bomber that was going to blow up LAX tried to enter through Canada. Nobody's come in through Mexico. Throwing money, more money at the Mexican border, I can't think of a more useless waste of money for the American taxpayer.
How big an obstacle is organized labor for making these changes?
They're not a big obstacle. They used to be, but they are not now. The rank and file is taking a longer time to be convinced. Their kind of knee-jerk reaction is, more workers is bad. But the organized labor at the top, they figured out that they're already down to 10% of the workforce. They can't go much lower. And these immigrants can be unionized. And if they're legal, they can be unionized. And this could be a growth for the future. So, and if you're unionized and you're working in a globalized economy, you've got to start thinking globally. And you've got to start thinking, let's set up North American unions that have agreements with United Auto Workers in Mexico. And they're starting to think more broadly and think ahead, and they're no longer the knee-jerk opposition to immigration reform that they once were. Yeah.
In 1986, what happened to the under 5-year?
Good question. A lot of things happened to them. Some of them went home. Some of them were related to people who got in under the 5-year thing and eventually adjusted status. Some of them are still in an undocumented status. So it was variable. We do know that on the eve of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, there were about 5 million illegal migrants in the United States. After the legalization program, there were about 2.5 million. So we cut the illegal population in half. Now it's at 11 million, so that tells you what's happened since then. I mean, it's just grown phenomenally. It's growing faster than it ever was before. Yeah.
What's happening to the illegal immigrants, the minors? Are they being educated?
They're being educated through high school, and then the barriers start coming in. The Supreme Court has decreed that they have a right to basic primary and secondary education in the United States. And and for the most part, they're in primary and secondary schools. The problem comes when they go to college. They can kind of slide their way into community colleges. And so if you go down to Mercer County Community College, you probably find some children of illegal migrants there. If you go to a 4-year school, it becomes more difficult. And if you go to a good private 4-year school like Princeton, it becomes even more difficult. You remember last year the celebrated case of Don El Padilla, the class salutatorian who came here when he was 2 or 3 years old, grew up in the United States, and is the top classics graduate in Princeton University, the top. He's Afro-origin Dominican. You'd think, oh, well, he's probably going to major in ethnic studies or something like that. No, he speaks fluent classical Greek and Latin, and he's the top classics person to come out in Princeton in 10 years. And we threw him out of the country. He's now attending Oxford in their PhD program. Because there was literally no way to legalize it. Congress has erected such a tangle of unforgiving laws now that even someone say, oh my God, the salutatorian at Princeton can't adjust status. What can a poor high school graduate who maybe has a beauty certificate from a beauty training school and working in a salon somewhere, what's their path of mobility? It's tough, very tough. Yeah.
One last question, and I'd like to ask it. In the Princeton area, besides Mexican immigrants, we have many people of Latino background from Guatemala and Honduras and Colombia and so many other countries. Mm-hmm. Have you seen any specific problems? They obviously do not have fences that keep them out or keep them in here. But do you see any problems from the other, besides Mexico, the other Latin American countries?
Yeah, I dwell on Mexicans because they're the 64,000 the 64-pound gorilla or whatever it is. They're big ones. Two-thirds of all Latinos in the United States are Mexican now. And if you look at illegal migration, there's Mexicans and then there's everybody else. And when you get to everybody else, the next biggest category collectively is Central Americans. So Salvadorans, Guatemalans, Hondurans, Nicaraguans. And really there you have to go on a country-by-country basis to explain what happened and how these people ended up in undocumented status. For Salvadorans and Guatemalans, a lot of them ended up here because of the Civil War. And the U.S. interventions in Central America in the 1980s destabilized their countries. Right-wing death squads were roaming the countryside, and indigenous people in particular were very vulnerable. Many of them fled to the United States seeking safe haven. And here they actually registered with the system, and many of them got temporary protected status. And then when the Cold War ends and we're no longer interested in fighting proxy wars in Central America, the United States kind of quietly just says, well, no more temporary protected status. Now they're out of status, but they've been here for 5, 10 years. They got kids. They don't want to go back. And that's how they end up in the situation. Their big mistake was they picked the wrong country to be born into. Now, if they'd been born into Nicaragua, where it was a left-wing government that came to power, and the Sandinistas were the bad people, and so the Nicaraguans, they came here and they got temporary protected status, but then when nobody was kind of looking, they passed special provisions in the law to allow them green cards through expedited procedures. So Guatemalans and Salvadorans languish in temporary protected status, and then Congress kind of quietly rescinds that, and they go out of status, and then they're stuck. Nicaraguans get a greased pathway into legal status because they're assumed to be right-thinking people who have fled communist tyranny to the south. And that's politics.
Thank you very much.